everyone, Mrs. Angel here, and I'm going to show you how to paint this simple Savior carving, this wood Jesus. It's an easy one to get started with. It'll look great and you'll learn a lot. I almost always paint wood carvings using folk art craft paints. They are a higher quality craft paint, so the pigment has better coverage, but they're still much more affordable than hobby grade miniature paints. So I'm using Imperial Red. It's a nice dark red. I think it's a great color for this project. Purple is also another good sash color for the Jesus, but it is up to you. You're gonna need a brown. I'm using Burnt Umber. This is your hair and beard color. And then you will need titanium white. This is your bright white color, and you can do the robe in this. Even if you choose a different color for the robe, you'll still want this for your dry brushing. And you could choose to do the robe in vintage white, and I'll show you the difference here on these two figures. So on this carving today, I'm using the titanium white. This one here uses vintage white, and both look pretty good. I do not recommend using linen. It is too dark and muddy looking. You will also need paint brushes. For this, you're probably going to want some kind of a flat brush. It can be a square or an angled brush. I have a small, flatter brush. You'll probably want a detail-ish brush. I don't have any good detail brushes right now. This is the best I have. And whatever your favorite dry brush is, this is my favorite dry brush. You'll also want some kind of a palette probably. Doesn't have to be this. You could just use a plate, for example. And you will also need water. A major mistake people make is not using enough water. This will make your paints get muddy. You rinse off the brush and it doesn't come clean. So this is a 1 quart container. I recommend something at least that size. And you're also going to need a paper towel or two. You can pick whether you want to paint the sash first or the robe. I prefer to paint the robe first, personally. You do not have to use a palette for your paints, but it can dry your paints out to leave them open, and you may want to water them down slightly. Do always wet your brush. Don't water the white down too much unless you want a semi-transparent look. If you do want to go for that transparent look, then water it down some more. Then you could just come in and paint away. So just keep painting, moving to a bigger brush if you want to for these large areas, and a smaller brush for these smaller areas. And of course, watching out if you do like I just did and sticking your finger in the wet paint, making sure you don't get that somewhere you don't want it in the future. Something to bear in mind whenever you're painting is that you should do your best to match the brush to the area being painted. So here on these big parts, I could actually go with a larger flat brush than what I'm using, but then I'd have to switch back and forth to a smaller brush. So I'm just going to stick with that. Something else you may notice is that I am working the paint in one direction. Over here on this part, I was primarily working down. You could also work up, but you don't want to scrub the paint back and forth and this way and that way unless you're trying to get in the grain or looking for a very specific look. See here, I'm just stroking downwards instead of going back and forth. And then coming in with the side of the brush up close like that to get in with that edging. If you work the paint back and forth and this way and that way, it can look really bad. As the paint starts to dry, you'll get little fuzzy bits, and you can see it sometimes, especially if it's semi-transparent and you're seeing the grain. It just looks best if you're working your paint all in one direction. While a flat brush is best for doing large areas, when it comes to little detail spots, you may want to get your smaller round brush to come in and be more accurate. Now you do want to make sure that your paint is fully dry before you move on to painting anything that could touch the wet paint. So I'm not going to paint the sash while the robe is wet, but I could come and paint the hair, for example. You can use a hairdryer to speed up this process, but I just let it dry naturally. Now with the brown, I do like to water it down because I don't want it to be super dark And also I like to see a little bit of the wood grain coming through. This is up to you. But one thing to keep in mind is that the craft paints can look very plasticky if you don't water them down just a touch. And some colors are worse about that than others. In my experience, the darker shades tend to look more plasticky. So I do like to water them down a bit. Watering the paint down is also going to help you get into all the folds in the hair, the part, and those little creases. And you'll see that I do turn my brush vertically to go inside those valleys, and then horizontal over the top to make sure that I get every part of the hair. And you may need to twist and turn to look from different angles, because sometimes one side or the other side in there won't be painted and you can't really tell unless you look at it from multiple different angles. Now, this is purely personal preference, but I don't want the hair and the beard to just meld into each other and be exactly the same color. So I like to add a bit more water or sometimes a bit of white to the brown before doing the beard. That's still a little darker than what I want. Let's get that off of there. So I'm going to add a little bit more water and lighten that color up a bit, make it a little bit more transparent as well. Now here, I don't care as much about the wet colors touching each other because they're the same color. So if they bleed a little bit, you can't really tell. As the paint dries, you may notice a little bit of variation, some wood coming through on the hair. I like that look on this figure. If you want to though, you can layer on more paint to even it out, but hair color usually has highlights and lowlights, and so this is really kind of more authentic looking. The same for the beard. I kind of like this semi-transparent look here, but I'm gonna add a tiny bit more. But that is up to you, and these will be dry brushed as well. I like to keep the skin the oiled color. If you get just a little bit of paint on there, you can come back with your knife after the paint is dry and very easily clean that up. So speaking of dry, the white is nice and dry, so we're gonna come in and do the red next. So again, this is the Imperial Red. It's a bit of a deeper red. You could do a brighter red if you wanted to, but I think this looks nice and Jesus-y, shall we say. I do water it down just a touch, and by water it down, I mean I'm getting the brush wet, not drying it on the paper towel, and then coming in. That's all. I'm going to use this same brush here for most of the sash, and then come back in with a smaller flat brush if I need to. Here for these close-in areas where I want to be sure I'm not going to get too much paint on the white and on the skin, I am going to switch to this smaller flat brush. You could also use a round brush. I sometimes do, though right now I don't have any round brushes that I like. So I learned how to paint. I used to work at a hobby store, and I painted 18mm high figures using very small brushes. So I'm accustomed to brushes that you buy in a one pack, and that single brush might cost you $5, $10, $12 for one brush. And that's the kind of level of detail brush that I like, but the wood really eats them up. So I try not to use such expensive brushes on wood. And I found some inexpensive brushes that I liked for detail on Amazon, but the last time I went to reorder them, they were not available. And I tried something else and they were unsatisfactory. But I do like the white brushes that you've seen these flat angle brushes from. I think that they work very well for the money. They do wear out, but anything is going to wear out quickly on wood. So I'm going to be linking those in the video description. You can see I did get a little bit of red on the white. I also am missing a tiny little corner of white down in there, so I'll just fix those up at the same time. Sometimes in the detail areas, you are gonna have to go across the grain instead of with the grain. It's just unavoidable sometimes. Right in here, I'm going to go for that round brush, even though it's not a very good one. It's still going to be my best bet. So before dry brushing, make sure everything is totally, completely dry. If it is a humid day, unless I absolutely have to get something done that day, I do not dry brush. I wait for a drier day. Today is dry, it is warm, and it is breezy. So this carving is going to dry very quickly, but I am going to let it fully dry before I come back in and do my dry brushing. If you have any spots that need touch up, like right here, what I recommend doing is getting some paint straight out of the bottle so you don't water it down, and you can stroke a little, but you're kind of almost dabbing. Oh, got some out of area there, but hey. So I kind of dab it on and then stroke it in a little bit. I need to get down in that corner, but this brush is really no good. I'm not going to worry too much about that up there because that's just going to be dry brushed. But yeah, straight out of the bottle instead of watering it down, and sort of dabbing on, especially if you have a color that's harder to cover with, such as white. And then if you need to, feathering it out a bit. Again, you'll see I'm working, pushing down, and lifting instead of scrubbing back and forth. And I think that is the only spot on here that needed touch up on this one. So neat tip for telling if something painted is dry enough to come back in with another layer is if it feels cool to the touch. Now in watercolor paints, use the back of your hand so you don't get oils on it. That's not as much of a problem here with these wood carvings, but if you touch it and it feels cool, that's a sign that it's still a little bit too wet to dry brush successfully. Okay, so whichever white you used for the robe, you are going to want probably nice bright white highlights. You do not have to do dry brushing, but it really just draws forth a little bit of detail, and this is a very simple carving, so I think it really benefits from some dry brushing. So for the dry brush, I honestly like to work straight out of the bottle, even though that does dry my paints out a little bit. I shake it up to make sure there's some on the lid. This is my favorite dry brush. It's just a really, really old flat brush. I personally don't like the big round dry brushes. You're going to need a paper towel. Get some paint, wipe almost all of it off. And then when you come in at an angle. So you're almost flat compared to this carving, and come across. Again, strokes in one direction. If you work back and forth, you'll get too much paint on there. You're just trying to hit those highlight points and call attention to the detail. I actually like to come in and get paint off of my paper towel instead of going straight back into the bottle. Remember, you can always add more. Also, if you use a clear coat, it does wash out some of this dry brushing. So the dry brushing, if you use a clear coat, will always look lessened after you spray it. So if you go a little bit heavy, that's fine, because it is going to be sort of watered down, if you will, even though there's no water involved. So I like the way that hair looks. So I'll get more, wipe almost all of it off. Here, there's less detail, but you're still gonna pick up a surprising amount. Again, holding it flat across the top, making sure you hit the edges the most, the natural high points, and trying not to get down into those troughs so much. That's what happens when you go into the bottle and you don't wipe enough off. You can get a little bit much. If you hurry, you can blot some off, but it's also completely fine. Like I said, some of that's going to be taken out when you do a spray, and it looks fine just the way it is. All right, there you have it. There is your simple savior carving. I hope you enjoyed.